So, what to expect when you're expecting? In talking to the department, those that got conditional CHAPs back last fall should expect unconditional CHAPs to be released mid-February, is when we expect. Those that did not previously receive conditional CHAPs, HUD Office of RAD is still going to continue application processing with those CHAPs and will issue upon approval. One thing to note here is that I've been told by the department they aren't so much processing them in order as where you are on the waiting list, but rather the thoroughness of your application, and they want to approve those that they feel will be quicker to the finish line. So based upon the application you put in, the thoroughness thereof, you can expect your CHAP in due course. We also expect that, and this I haven't confirmed with them, but the original 60,000 award 2 years ago, HUD released all 60,000 CHAPs at one time period, which caused quite a delay in the marketplace because a lot of people weren't ready for that many applications to come in, both the service providers, developers, and also HUD's review team. So we do expect that the next 125,000 units will be sort of titrated over time, and we do have until 2018 to complete the process, so to give us ample time to get these through. Special exception here, and I wanted to bring this up because it's very important. If you're planning a LIHTC application, the 9% competitive rounds, please review your qualified allocation plan to see when the deadline is. We brought it up to the attention of the department that Tennessee's is February 3rd, and if they're issuing CHAPs in mid-February, then no one can make a tax credit application because for the application to go in, most states require you to submit a CHAP with your 9% application. We know that the state of Virginia that I'm in is March 6th is the deadline, so we're closely watching that date to make sure that the RAD applicants on the waiting list in the state of Virginia at least get their CHAPs prior to that so they can make applications as need be. So I do implore you to look at the QAP in your state. And if there's a timing issue, bring it up to the department. They're being very flexible about this, and we know that the Tennessee awards, RAD awards, are going to get CHAPs earlier than the rest of the country in order to comply with the application deadline. One interesting note as well is what to expect when you're expecting is mid-March we do expect a revision of the RAD notice. The original housing notice is now over 2 years old, and they're going to revise that and put in, actually revision 2 of the notice is 1.5 years old. But we're going to have revision 3 of the notice, which is going to include all the FAQs that have been issued, frequently asked questions, as well as any extra guidance programmatically related that's been given either through the Office of Multifamily Housing or SAC has issued some guidance as well. We also expect a simplified processing method for self-finance RAD deals, those that can transform from Section 9 to Section 8 rents without debt or equity. Maybe we hope to see simplified processing and quicker processing for those. And I did mention SAC, and we do anticipate that notice to have much clearer guidance about the cohesiveness, or I should say the harmony between SAC and RAD, as opposed to friction. They want to create harmony of those two programs. So get ready, go. When you get your conditional CHAP, it's finally not conditional, it's a real CHAP. You have 365 days in which to get your RAD conversion done. The original 60,000 units of awardees of RAD were given a lot of leeway in these time frames. We don't expect as much leeway in the second round because the process is much more defined now. I did note some very important milestones here that involve what we're talking about, but also are important because they can change the structure of your deal very much. So the first one of the first milestones you must achieve is milestone day 90. And that's submission of your RAD Physical Condition Assessment, the RPCA. We'll be talking about the components of the RPCA, how to vet an RPCA contractor, how to get ready for your RPCA. But at day 90, that's very important because that will set the uses of any monetary funding that you have. When I say uses, it will identify the capital needs for the project, both critical capital needs, near-term capital needs, as well as a 20-year capital needs snapshot. And all of that combined has to be cohesive with your financing plan to prove that the project can stand on its own legs upon going to the Section 8 platform. Milestone 180 is another important date, and that's the submission of the environmental site assessment. Site assessment reporting requirements in RAD. The original RAD notice was rather moot on this subject. but on December 4th of 2014, HUD issued environmental guidance for RAD transactions. We'll talk about that a bit. But one thing I want the audience should note is that so day 90, we're sizing our capital needs for you, but then day 180 is the environmental site assessment. Any of you out there that's been involved in a redevelopment project or adaptive reuse project or a substantial rehabilitation knows that asbestos, lead-based paint, radon, and hazardous materials or underground storage tanks can add sizable cost to a project. So we recommend, and I'll say this a few times, that your environmental site assessment should be done with your milestone 90 in order to size all the capital needs which may involve environmental remediation aspects. God forbid you do your full chat, you do your RPCA, it sizes it, let's say $20,000 a door or so, and then 90 days later at milestone 180 you get your environmental done and there's an extra $5,000 or $10,000 per door in remediation expense. That's a big surprise at that point, especially considering milestone 180 is when your financing plan needs to be done. So if you follow the CHAP milestones this way, your consultant or you may be in for a surprise at that 180 and have to resize the project. So consideration of timing is very important. I want to get into the capital needs assessment. As you may know, RAD was really generated as a capital needs assessment-driven program. In 2010, a HUD study was done that identified roughly $26 billion in backlog of repairs in public housing. This number is rather staggering considering that capital fund grants typically average $2 billion at most any given year. Just by the math, it's a dog chasing its tail. More recent studies are estimating that the $26 billion in today's dollars is around $48 billion, upwards even 50 potentially capital needs. One of the staggering things is there's a $3 billion accrual of these capital needs every year that we don't proceed with a conversion or a way to deal with these capital needs in an expeditious manner. So the RAD PCNA really drives the bus for RAD transactions. The RAD PCNA includes 3 scopes of work in one. This is key to understand. Many public housing agencies understand capital needs assessments that you had to do every 5 years to get your capital fund grants. Many of you may understand the GPNA requirement, which is currently in suspension for public housing, but we all got ready for. RAD builds upon both those and goes a step further. So there's 3 scopes in one. First one is a green PCNA, or green capital needs assessment, or project capital needs assessment. They're ubiquitous terms. But the greening part is that capital needs assessment must be reviewed by a USGBC LEED professional. That's a United States Green Building Council LEED, L-E-E-D, professional who looks at it and makes sure that the green recommendations, or the recommendations are make sense. Second scope of work is an ASHRAE Level 2 energy audit. Very key part here is it needs to be authored or performed by a Building Performance Institute accredited individual or a ResNet accredited individual. ASHRAE Level 2 energy audits are whole building energy audits, looking at all uses and all sources of any utilities, so all water, all gas, all electric. All the utilities have to be looked at. The key part is here is many of you out there may already have an energy audit on file that you had done by a local consultant or contractor or by an energy performance contractor. Some of the concerns we see with energy audits is while they may be useful data for you to manage your project, they often don't meet the ASHRAE Level 2 stringent requirement because they aren't typically whole building assessments. They don't contain paybacks. They don't contain savings to investment ratios. They don't contain ACA Manual J studies about the heating and cooling loads of units. So all these things come into play. So the ASHRAE Level 2 energy audit is an advanced energy audit. In the third scope of work for the RPCA is a utility consumption baseline. And this is really the housing authority or the utility provider providing a year's worth of utility data for all meters and all sources on the project. Obviously, if it's a master metered project like an elderly tower, it's an easy task because it might just be 1 meter. But in some of these projects that are scattered site or multiple townhome environments, it could be 100 to 200 different meters out there. And HUD's asking us to ask the housing authority to get data for all those meters, even if they're privately paid utilities by your tenant. So that creates complications with data. We'll talk more about that as well. The RAD PCNA really concludes with 2 deliverables. One, we must produce a written report, typically provide an Adobe Acrobat, or PDF as people call it. And your RAD reports typically bordering on 100 to 200 pages in length, very detailed. I've seen a lot of capital needs assessments that local contractors have done for housing authorities, and you might see a 10 or 15-page piece of paper with some pictures that identifies capital needs. The RAD PCNA is far more advanced than that. So it's a written report. As important as that written report is an interactive Excel tool. And HUD currently has a version of the tool you download from the web, and in that we enter the property information, very similar to our report, but it's a calculator. The RAD Excel tool will calculate your funding mechanisms. It'll calculate the initial deposits to the reserves as well as the annual deposits to the reserves to fund the capital needs of that project over a period of 20 years. Also in that tool, it's very important, a lot of green data goes in, a lot of consumption. So we know a refrigerator will use X number of kilowatt hours per year. That stuff's very important, so we put that in there, and if you're going with a higher green standard than what's typically there right now, HUD will credit you for that energy savings. And in that toolbook, it calculates the dollars saved of utility use, which will help HUD underwrite that value to reduce your expense burden per ratio. I think it's imperative for all public housing authorities to at least understand the RAD Excel tool, its functions and objectives. I recommend playing in one. Neat thing is that when we're done with a project, we actually email out the interactive copy of the tool, and both the transaction manager, who's the HUD side of the reviewer, as well as the public housing agency, you all, play with the tool a little bit, move things around, put in different values. If we say carpet is $17 per square yard, and you know that you've paid historically only $13 per square yard, make that change or tell us to make that change, because all those things in there can change the funding mechanisms. Okay, there we go. I mentioned RAD Environmental Guidance. The original RAD notice that came out just had us complete something called HUD Form 4.4, which was just a 2-page environmental quick study of what may be there. HUD realized early on that this was insufficient when we involved financing schemes, debt equity, or leveraging in a program. So they put out more environmental guidance on December 4th. It's nice for you all to be the second wave adopters because this guidance is there in front of you now. Unfortunately, the first 60,000 RAD units were given this guidance in December and had to post-actively make it apply, and so scramble to get environmental stuff out. But at least we all know, the ones that are invited to this training program today, how to proceed from this point forward. Environmental guidance is clear. But the environmental guidance, there's multiple tracks in the guidance, but the first thing is what's your financing plan structure? If you're using FHA, it's one track for environmental studies. If you're not using FHA, it's a separate track for environmental studies. And then we go one step further and say, is it project-based rental assistance that you're applying for, or project-based vouchers? And those, again, have different environmental requirements. I wrote a white paper on this publishing on December 17th. You can find it on our website that really makes it clear. I don't want to go into it too much right now because it could take an entire hour of itself, but that white paper is 2 pages long and it simplifies over 18 pages of HUD guidance. But if you are using FHA mortgage insurance, which we do see a lot of RAD projects that are seeking debt and debt equity, we think about 70% of them are seeking FHA mortgage insurance, HUD 221D4 program or HUD 223F program, because it streamlines quite nicely. If you are following FHA, then you just follow what we call the Multifamily Accelerated Process Guide, the MAP Guide. The MAP Guide's been around for over a decade, and there's many contractors out there, consultants that know how to work with this guide, as well as lenders that are very familiar with the processes they're in. One thing about the MAP Guide, because it is federal mortgage insurance, it is quite stringent on asbestos testing, lead-based paint testing, radon testing, as well as other environmental concerns. When I get into lessons learned in a few slides, we'll talk about things you can get ready for your application. But one thing I want to point out is that if you've done any environmental testing in your portfolio in the past, start accumulating those documents, because many of those can be used, even if they're 10 years old. Data is still data. So if you get that data together, it can often mitigate some of the costs to make environmental compliance happen at the 180-day milestone. And lastly, with environmental guidance, if you're doing LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits, 4 or 9%, ensure your consultant knows the state qualified allocation plan rules. This is so important. Environmental consultants are a dime a dozen. They're out there everywhere. There's many of them. But how many of them understand structured and mixed financing? How many know the QAP rules? For example, in Alabama, if you didn't know the rules, you wouldn't know that all sub-rehabs are required to have radon mitigation systems put in at the time of design, in the tax credit program. That's very important. If you miss that step, you could violate the tax credit rules. So your environmental consultant needs to know that up front. And that's with or without testing that shows radon may be there. They just want to be proactive. So as I said earlier, we've assessed close to 20,000 units of RAD conversions of the first 60,000. So we've done a large percentage of them. Worked for most of the large housing authorities out there, as well as a lot of the medium and small housing authorities, so all different sizes. Looking back at the data, we really find RAD fits into 3 buckets, and I often refer to 3 buckets of RAD. I'll use those terms quite often, but bucket number 1 is what we call self-finance projects. These are projects that aren't going to seek any debt or equity. Really, they're using the cash on hand, the reserves that they have, combined with the future Section 8 rents. We call this ADRRs and IDRRs, preservation deals. You're preserving a housing using an initial deposit to replacement reserves and ongoing needs through the annual deposit to replacement reserves. These dollars, which are usually reflected in the cost per unit, will be an outcome of the RAD Capital Needs Assessment Excel tool. Bucket number 1, self-finance projects, we find most of those are ones that have been well capitalized, generally good condition, and also projects that actually usually received a lot of the ARRA stimulus funds. So they have some new windows, some new roofs, some new HVAC systems, well capitalized. We've been very successful at these. When I say successful, 1,900 units over 95 scattered miles in a southeastern state. It is a preservation deal. It's quite a challenge. We have another one right now that we're working on where actually they went for a 9% application and a 4% application, both of which the numbers didn't work out very well. We sort of stepped in the deal a little late to help save it, and we looked at the numbers and realized that in their 4% application, most of the stuff that they were proposing to replace now still had 5, 6, 7 years of useful life left. And it seemed to me it wasn't their time, wasn't the appropriate time to go after tax credit equity. The best time for them is fully depreciate the equipment and do it in 4 years. We looked at it that way, and actually we're working right now, and should get an RPCA any day, that conversion commitment on this, where we took a 4% deal and crosswalked to bucket 1 self-preservation projects with a very high annual initial deposit to reserve, annual deposits of around $500 per unit being escrowed, and it funds the project, which allows them to convert to a Section 8 platform and then do a 4% or 9% application on their own time without the rigidity of the CHAP milestones. So bucket 1, very creative. Many people say they're easier. In talking to the RAD consultants that I know in my own experience, they're actually quite difficult because you got to make the numbers either work or they don't work. There's a lot of massaging. But the main thing is the goal of all of this is to make sure the housing exits on a stable foundation and is preserved. And that's the key part of bucket 1. Bucket number 2, a small amount of debt. We haven't seen a lot of these. I'd say less than 5% of the RAD projects we did. Back to bucket 1, I think about 20% of the projects we see will fall into that category. But a small amount of debt, and this is usually using HUD's 223F refinance program, GSEs, which are Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Fannie Mae is becoming active in RAD, or community bank financing, which we've actually had 2 RAD deals work where the community bank stepped up and said, we're going to invest in affordable housing in our industry, and we will help you with your initial deposit to the reserves. Typically, these are projects that have repairs of less than $15,000 per unit. And I say that because HUD's 223F program is typically geared for projects that have less than $15,000 per unit repairs. If you have more than that, you typically have to go to bucket 3. But while we're talking of bucket 2 and a small amount of debt, please understand that in the RAD program, the way the housing notice was written for it, is Davis-Bacon wage rates cannot be avoided on any immediate repairs. So if I say a project needs $15,000 per unit of repairs now, Davis-Bacon does apply to that. In many of your markets, it may not affect the cost, but in highly urban markets or in projects that are greater than 5 stories and 4 stories in height, it can be a 20–25% increase in wage rates. So if you can't avoid Davis-Bacon, we often recommend just go to bucket 3. There's bucket 3, 4%, 9%, a little more cash available, but it's a debt equity transaction. Those housing authorities that have done Hope 6 projects and mixed finance projects in the past, this doesn't scare them. The smaller housing authorities, mid-size, that haven't done those transactions, this is a scary endeavor. But don't be that scared. LIHTC is a wonderful program, and you're still going to retain ownership of the project if you structure it properly. So in these, we see the 4 and 9% projects. As I mentioned, 9% are competitive applications. There will be a deadline in your given state. 4% are usually rolling applications, non-competitive. Historically, the 9% are oversubscribed. I would say maybe 30% of applicants actually get awards, whereas the 4% are typically undersubscribed, and there's plenty of authority out there to get those. Key part here is if you're going to bucket 3, and you know the level of rehab you're anticipating, and we can classify it as gut rehab. And by HUD's FAQs, they classify gut as the majority of sheetrock being removed during the rehabilitation event, meaning ceilings and wet walls, bathrooms and kitchen walls, wet walls we call those. If you're planning on that level of rehab, tell your needs assessor up front. And the reason is we can get a waiver of Parts 2 and 3 of the RPCA. Back to the previous slide, the RPCA is a capital needs assessment with an energy audit and a UCB. If you're doing gut rehab, we can get a waiver on the energy audit as well as the UCB. And that could save you roughly 50% of your cost of your capital needs assessment. So important to know that up front if we're going gut rehab. If there's any questions, feel free to type them in or raise a hand. Questions on the fly, I certainly like. Next slide. Okay. Common issues and lessons learned. This is sort of my favorite topic because, as I said, the first 60,000 of RAD participants in the original tranche is a steep learning curve. A lot of us in the industry tripped, fell down, got back up, kept running. HUD seemed to issue guidance every other day. I believe if you look at the FAQs, it's over 80 pages of type 8 font now. That's a lot of FAQs. So it's been a constant evolving process. And now we see the next tranche, you guys, the second 125,000 units. We have a much clearer understanding of processing. But lessons learned are important to convey so you can learn from previous missteps. So one of the first things you need to do to get ready for Milestone 90 is select your RPCA provider. Many housing authorities will issue a blind RFP and solicit individuals to put a price in for the RPCA. I understand procurement rules, and that might be why a lot of you do it. Headquarters says it's not a requirement for RAD because it's such a selective, it's such a highly technical study, much like an architect, that negotiation can't happen. We often recommend to our clients or potential clients issue an RFQ, request for qualifications, not a request for proposals. Shortlist who should be qualified even to put numbers in. Here's some examples. Are they RAD savvy? And I like to say RAD savvy, meaning have they received a minimum of 5 RCCs, RAD conversion commitments? Have you worked on enough projects to actually have 5 get to the finish line? If you haven't got one on the finish line yet, I'd be wary. This is important because recently I was at a RAD training, and more than 3/4 of the participants in the training were REAC inspectors that thought they were going to get into RAD. And if any of you followed a REAC inspector around at your site, do you really want them doing your RAD study? To do a RAD study, you need to have some knowledge of underwriting and mixed financing in order to make the financing plan work. So qualifications, rhythmic financing is very important. Also with the HUD MAP Guide, back to the multifamily accelerated process. The MAP Guide's been around for over a decade, and a lot of the nuances of the studies in RAD are built upon the MAP Guide. So understanding that is almost a precursor to doing RAD, if you ask me. If you're going to have the environmental side done by your PCNA provider, what's their knowledge of environmental rules? There's definitely synergies and cost savings for housing authorities to have your project capital needs assessor also do the environmental site assessment at the same time. Much more cohesiveness, and you really get the financing plan figured out early. But again, does the RPCA provider understand 24 CFR Part 50 and Part 58? Part 50, of course, is PD-RA contracts, and Part 58 is PDV contracts. But both of them are slightly different nuances of environmental regulations. If you're going to be seeking debt or equity, that's back to bucket 3. Is the provider in good graces with your future lender, syndicator, or development partner? Ask them. The lenders out there in the FHA world for 221D4 and 223F since they're underwriting a project and they have a lot of risk in the game, they really like to control who the needs assessors are sometimes, or at least pre-qualify them. God forbid you went with lowest bid on RFP, use the consultant, and then your equity provider or lender says, nope, we don't want to use them, and have to have it redone. It sounds like a horror story, but the horror story we've been involved in at least a dozen times in the past year. So I would vet who you're going to use with the partners that the team you've assembled. If you're also using LIHTC Bucket 3, do they know the state QAP rules? Are they pre-qualified by the states? Some states like Indiana, for example, you need to be a licensed engineer in the state in order to sign a property needs assessment that goes to the tax credit equity. So, example, in Indiana, a PHA used somebody else that wasn't. They got the full RAD assessment done. They tried to submit to the state allocating agency, and the state allocating agency said, nope, we won't accept this. So we had to step in and redo the whole kit and caboodle to get that approved for the equity side. So again, is your RPCA provider, if you're going LIHTC, are they approved in good graces with the state allocating agency? Very important to understand that. And when in doubt, ask your TM. That's a transaction manager. HUD's going to assign a transaction manager. And while they aren't allowed to promote any capital needs assessor, if you ask them what you think about, they will answer your question. And some needs assessors make their jobs easier by providing data that can be easily underwritten. And other needs assessors provide data in a convoluted manner in which it's very hard for them. So talk to your TM. Also TAs, technical assistants. As you may know, HUD has contracted roughly 3 consultants in the country that are technical assistance providers on HUD's dime. And if you're using one of those, they're private entities. Ask them what they think. Most of you have a consultant involved. See what they think, what experience they've had with different providers. And finally, ask HUD. The Will Wavies and the Greg Burns of the world will be candid with you if you want to vet somebody. So if you're using a request for proposal process, first thing I say is proceed with caution. We really like the RFQs because you just go by base price. I hate to say it, but you often get what you pay for in this industry. And I would hate to see someone have to redo the scope of work. The RFQ is better suited because of that complex scope. Getting back to the scope we talked about, 3 parts. I mean, you need a needs assessor, you need an energy auditor trained by BPI, and you need to be able to do a utility function baseline. Those are 3 different trades. The MAP Guide allows the needs assessor to subcontract those bits and pieces. Other third parties have vertically integrated all those pieces in their process. Vertical integration, we feel, makes a much better cohesive report with less revisions and quicker processing time for HUD. A big one here is if you do RFPs and you get back proposals is look at the fine print the consultants have. Some housing authorities have learned the hard way. There's some consultants out there that say that there's only 1 revision. And any revisions after 1 is $175 per hour in charge. Our average PCNA goes through 5 to 10 revisions. Our model is different in that we're all inclusive because we believe in the deal and we'll hold the hand until the finish line. But if you go with one of the consultants that does have a limitation of revisions, or has an exorbitant extra charge for additional work that's undefined at the front end, expect to pay almost twice as much for your RPCA. So definitely you got to vet those small prints that the consultants give you in their proposals. It may be, if you do an RFP RFQ, is to say that you assume that this includes 5 revisions. That's probably a good safe number to work with. But it's good to vet that as well. So the next slide is just something I put together actually recently, and that hard to read, but if you email Joe, he'll send you a copy of this for your own use. A lot of RFQs we get to bid on a project, they give us the AMP number and maybe the project name, and that's it. And that's really not enough information to sharpen the pencil on RPCA. RPCA costs will range between $60 a unit all the way up to $120 a unit, depending upon the nature of the project. All projects are different. So just going down this is, yes, general information is property name, physical address, AMP number, and PHA name. But then site-specific is very important. And number of units and number of buildings is important, because though we only, under RAD, you have to access 25% of all units plus vacants and downs, which usually equals about 30% of overall units based upon most waiting lists. But we also have to walk every single building. So you think of these projects that are scattered site or have multiple duplexes, that's a lot of exterior structures we need to walk. So the number of buildings is very important. Land size matters because obviously we're walking the entire piece of property. Use group, multifamily or elderly. We think this is important. And the reason is you're going to see in lessons learned that projects that, or AMPs, if you have a multifamily AMP and an elderly AMP, you can't rent bundle those in a RAD transaction. We need to know what they are up front to make sure we don't pollute the toolbooks by putting multifamily with elderly in the same Excel tool. So knowing what the use group is very important. Date of construction is vague just because we can expect sort of a level of repairs. One thing we take upon ourselves is also to look in HUD's database, what we call RAMPS data, to see what kind of ARARA funds or area funds you received, whether you replaced windows, HVAC, what you may have done. Because the combination of those capital funds you received, grant funds, as well as the age, we get an idea of what we're to expect in the housing stock. We put on here utility structure, and this is very important. And really it's coming down to the master meter, individually metered. 99 times out of 100, water and sewers master meters, but 60 times out of 100, electric and gas is individually metered, meaning responsibility of the tenant. This is very important because back to the UCB, which is part 3 of the RPCA, if you have a master meter building, it's really just 12 months of data entry, 12 lines of entry for us for master meter buildings. But if I have 100 units in separate water and gas, that's 2,400 different lines of data I need to enter to reflect 12 months of data for 100 units. A much greater data entry. So if you want to have a sharp pencil on your RPCA cost, know what your utility structure is up front and communicate that to the needs assessor. Next one's really big, type of site. Contiguous or scattered site. Contiguous meaning one project, one parcel of land is how we look at it, whether it has 100 buildings or one building, as long as it's one parcel of land. Scattered site, though, is exactly what it means. We've been involved in many housing authorities that took distressed 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, and 3-bedroom homes from the community and made an AMP out of them over the years. And you have 200 units scattered over miles and miles with no contiguous aspect. Obviously, that changes the demographics of the property and the way we approach the study. HUD did issue something called the Scattered Site Memo early in RAD, which will be brought into the housing notice we expect in March. And it actually left a lot of flexibility to needs assessor to determine how many workbooks to do. An example being, we did scattered sites of almost 300 units in one county in Illinois, and all different dates of construction, but all 1, 2, and 3-bedroom individual single-family homes. And rather than divide up by the 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms, we looked at utility structures and did one toolbook for all the gas utility ones, one toolbook for all the electric utility ones, and then one for all the blended. And because it was easier to represent the property types that way. But with scattered sites, often it will precipitate additional questions to figure out how we're going to structure it. Some needs assessors, believe it or not, will quote to do an Excel toolbook for every individual scattered site. It does not need to be done that way, and it far complicates the process. But we believe the fewer toolbooks you can justify, the more simplified processing with HUD, and the easier, the better the transaction manager will like doing your project. Reduced number of toolbooks is key, I believe. We also asked a proposed financing plan. And this is just so we understand which way you're thinking of going, because it may precipitate additional questions, or programmatic repairs. Obviously, preservation, self-finance, report to capital needs, and see if you guys have enough cash on hand to make these deals work. When we get into low debt bank loans, whether you use FHA, or whether you use Fannie Mae, or Freddie Mac, or conventional, each of those have their own rules as well. And those rules may be ancillary to the RAD process, but we need to make sure that we incorporate those other rules into our RAD process so the funding schedule, the financing program is right. No one likes making a lot of changes after the 180-day milestone because everyone has to sort of take 2 steps back to go forward again. So very important. And the last one, if you're doing a live tech rehab, it's imperative that you mention that to needs assessor because large level of repairs don't fit well into the Excel tool gave us, but we still need to adapt them to that tool. And those are a process, a lot more involvement typically, but we do enjoy those. And again, most live tech authorities, allocating agencies have their own set of rules that we need to make sure we're aware of at the process during the inspection. Turnaround time, obviously that's for you guys to determine. If you look at the 90-day milestone, I mean, you really have 90 days. Most of our RAD PCNAs are usually on a 5-week turnaround time. It's comfortable. It can be done in 4 if you have a very organized PHA with all the utility data ready and their list of what I call owner wish lists or owner repairs they know they want. A well-prepared housing authority could get it done in 4 weeks, but comfortable with 5 to 6 weeks to get most RAD reports done because of the intensity of the study. We put on here if you want an environmental assessment or not, and that's just do you want to have it done before the milestone 180 or at 90 or at the 180. It's your choice, but obviously we talked about the definite pros of having it done early. If you're doing environmental, PBV or PBRA does matter because that combined with the financing scheme will determine the level of environmental diligence we have to conduct. And again, if you like this form, Joe can be sure to send it to anybody that wants a copy of it. So, lessons learned. We really find that the RAD physical condition assessment is the point of greatest resistance to a successful conversion. My firm's been doing capital needs assessments for greater than 20 years, side by side with the Department of Housing and Urban Development as well as the GSEs. We only do housing. And I can honestly say is RAD is unlike any other capital needs assessment ever. Because of that Excel toolbook they give us. It's the first true capital needs assessment that really builds upon utility savings in green. It's wonderful. I love the program, but it's challenging. And for a REAC inspector, I think they can do one. It's a mighty tall task. I know speaking for our company, it takes usually 6 to 8 months just to get a capital needs assessment doing housing for a long time, even to understand the RAD process. So onboarding has been interesting for many firms to get people up to speed to do RAD. But a good PCNA can make or break your project because it's important at the 90-day milestone and especially at the 180-day milestone financing plan. We believe it's important for housing authorities to identify expectations and goals early on to meet milestones. The sheet before I talked about which financing plan were you hoping to go, whether it be self-finance, a little bit of debt, or LIHTC structure. Knowing that up front for the needs assessor is very important because he'll craft the report to meet that intent. Now, we always may not be able to meet the intent, especially in self-finance, because the capital needs may be so great that it doesn't work. But if we don't know which way you're going, we don't know whether to make repairs to say that they're now, meaning in the next 12 months, or if they're year 1, meaning outside a little bit, or year 2, and where to put the timing of repairs. So knowing your expectations and goals is paramount. And your needs assessor should be asking you that question up front. Number 3, For success, I encourage all housing authorities to assemble energy utility data in advance in order to meet the milestones. Even though you haven't got your real CHAP yet, or maybe you haven't got an unconditional CHAP or conditional CHAP, I'd be getting utility data together today. Really start assembling a year's worth of utility data. Obviously, house meters or master metered is easy, but the individual tenants and sub-metering is difficult. Often you need to go through tenant release forms. Some of those, especially in the southeastern states, will find that if you contact your local utility provider, they can provide whole property data for all tenants. Anonymously, they do provide it. So I also encourage you to contact a utility provider and see if they will help you prepare that. It may cost a little bit. It may also take 4 to 6 weeks to get that data, and that's why starting it now is important, because really a needs assessor cannot complete an RPCA until they have the utility data. We can get a draft done, and you can start looking at numbers, but the RAD team, the transaction manager, will not approve an RPCA that does not have utility data in it. Now back to individually metered utility data, we have got some reprieve from the department saying that a minimum of 25% of the units must be included in that subset of data. So when I said all meters, all sources, that's the way the technical guidance is written in the housing notice. But if you look at the FAQs, in individually metered properties, HUD does let us get by with a minimum of 25% of 1 year's data from representative units. So 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, whatever you may have at your project. Number 4 is a big one that threw some roadblocks up early in some of our RAD deals. Is if you have existing energy performance contracts, or if you've got capital fund financing plan agreements, identify those up front to your consultant or to your needs assessor. And I say this because with EPCs, many of the early RAD projects had to buy out their EPCs. But if an EPC is in place, and let's just say it has 8 more years on it for a boiler, we need to know that to determine, does that future boiler cost go in the reserves, or do we assume the EPC will be re-implemented? As for capital fund financing program, that is more or less a version of debt you may have on your books. It's very important because in the process of doing a RAD conversion, especially in bucket number 3 LIHTC, the equity partners want those CFFPs paid off. So you got to look at that additional transactional cost. One note on EPCs, if anybody in the audience is considering an EPC, I would right now say don't do it. If you want to call and talk to me about it, I'd love to tell you why. But one of the main things about an EPC is that, sure, someone will put in a boiler and windows and water savers for you, but they're also going to take a large percentage of the future savings from those items. But within RAD, you're able to put those boilers, windows, and water savers in yourself and capitalize on 100% of the savings going forward. That can dramatically change the expense burden ratio on your units. So consider that. I would look at RAD as an EPC, but a much more robust EPC. Number 5, identify available and predictable sources of funding early. I could hit this a couple different ways, but if you're using FHA mortgage insurance programs or Fannie Mae or LIHTC, as soon as you know, let your needs assessor know. Now, it's often we're doing needs assessments, and a lot of times the financing plan hasn't been structured, so I don't know which way they're going. But if you know you're heavily considering one funding source over another, have a conversation with your needs assessor, because that could change the capital needs based upon the risk tolerance levels or guidance of that ancillary source of capital. 6, coordinate environmental site assessment early. I hit on this as well, but again, I'm putting it here because one of the lessons learned is the first 60,000 adopters, they didn't get the environmental site assessments until almost December, a year after they got their plans in, and we're having to backtrack on some of the, not so much backtrack, but add uses for of the cash they have in order to deal with environmental remediation that maybe someone didn't think about. Accumulate existing environmental data as available. It's very important to understand that asbestos data doesn't go stale, doesn't get old. If it tested for asbestos 10 years ago, it's still the asbestos today. Lead-based paint data, if it was done in accordance with the Title 10, EPA Title 10 and HUD's testing methodology, that data is good forever. Some of the RAD data we get wasn't done per the federal rules, but again, we like to use what you have first and then backfill what we may need after that. If you've ever converted from oil heating fuel to gas or heating fuel to electric, those tank reports of removal are very, very important. So try to dig those out of your files because those could slow down a transaction as you get to day 180. Because HUD needs to verify that, you know, that tank was removed, but there was no residual contamination, and those old reports should show that. So any environmental data, please assemble it. Number 8. This is a neat one that hit probably about a half dozen of our RAD projects, is that if the structure changes, notify the TM and revise the CHAP. Let me rephrase this. That when you get a CHAP award, it's going to say, here's the number of units you have in your CHAP, here's the number of buildings you have. But often when we get to the financing plan, we're realizing that, God, we can combine two properties together and have synergies. I'll talk about that. But once I do that, I all of a sudden, now it's not cohesive with the original CHAP award. Or we had one where it was all efficiencies, and we found halfway through that, you know, half of these we should combine some efficiencies to make one bedroom. Much better marketability for them. But that was a structural change. In those cases, as soon as you know you're doing a structural change that is different from the paper CHAP you get, talk to your TM. HUD often wants to revise that CHAP so the CHAP meets your financing plan at day 180. So be aware of that. And they allow that to happen. Don't be scared by that. I would say most of my RAD projects will go through some evolution of change. Just because when we get out there, we find something different. Or we find, hey, this is a better idea to go this way than that way. So this happens quite a bit, but just be aware of that. And the TM, Transaction Manager, and the last one is a big part, get to know your TM. These transaction managers, HUD has hired some of the best and brightest to run this program. I'm very excited about the program, great flexibility. And the TMs are really neat people, willing to help, willing to bend over backwards and work for your transactions. So don't be scared of them, get to know them and talk to them, over-communicate if need be about your project. If there's any questions, feel free to type them in there on the chat feature. Okay, some common issues we have. First one's a big one. Rent roll review and overhoused conditions. We've seen many public housing agencies that will rent to the next available waiting list member on their waiting list. And in doing so, you might find a family that only needs one bedroom and a 4-bedroom unit. You know, or adversely, you might find some units where you find a couple that was able to finally negotiate their way through the process enough to get a 2-bedroom unit when they don't really need one. They have a little home office or something. One thing to realize in RAD, there's 2 things to realize here. First is overhoused conditions. If you are renting 4 and 5 bedrooms to 2 people in only 2-bedroom, but you don't have a unit that's right size to move them to, HUD's likely to underwrite that 4 or 5-bedroom as a 2-bedroom in the pro forma for RAD conversion. That really limits the cash flow coming in on the contract rent. That's the first scenario. The second scenario is more of a public relations issue for public housing, and that is, under RAD, all residents have a right to return. They can't be kicked out. They will have a unit when they come back. However, under RAD, you right-size that unit. So the couple that negotiate for a 2 or 3-bedroom over a number of years and finally have it, they're going to have to realize that they probably aren't going to come back in that same unit. They're going to come back into units that's right size for their family size. So that's a very important thing to understand with RAD. But no one will lose the right to housing since they're going to be right sized during the process. A common issue is scattered site properties. And there's 2 variants of scattered sites. Variant 1 is your true scattered site where I have townhomes all over the place. We did one that was 195 townhomes all over one inner city location. Another one I talked about that was 1,900 units over 95 square miles in a very rural location. Had another one that was roughly 300 single-family homes over an entire county in Illinois. So we've done some various strange, that's sort of the first variant where it's really truly scattered. The second scattered site property is actually one that we create for synergies, and the best example is one we just got RCC on, where you had a project that was 60 units, one that was 80 units, and one that was about 42, 43 units. Individually, very hard to do financing of it. But together, we had almost 180 units. I had synergy. And a 180-unit tax credit application works really well. They were all within 2-3 miles of each other in the same city, same jurisdiction, same utility providers. So we actually made technically 3 scattered campuses, 1 project. Creativity in RAD, and it worked beautifully. But the scattered site property, because they're so variable, this is where your needs assessor really needs to understand the RAD program and the toolbook, because reporting on scattered sites is a delicate issue. Obviously, as I said before, we like to have as few toolbooks as possible for faster HUD processing. But in doing so, we just don't want to jam all in one toolbook, because we got to justify to HUD why we did it such a way. And if you use 2 field toolbooks, have to detangle it, it actually confuses the process even more. So scattered site properties take a pragmatic approach to how to report it. Common issues, use group, elderly versus multifamily. And I bring this up because if you end up using the HUD mortgage insurance programs, you cannot combine an elderly and a multifamily project in the same loan transaction. It's a violation of 24 CFR Part 200. So those have to be separate packages. Even more so, even if you don't use FHA processing, but you're still doing some other type of transaction, HUD really needs those workbooks, Excel workbooks, to be separate by use group classification. In some of the early RADs, there were some projects that had half an elderly component and half a multifamily component. Did one toolbook, and HUD made them detangle that into 2 reports, 2 toolbooks. So understanding those classifications are key. Now, one thing about the elderly classification, just because you say it's, hey, that's for elderly people, that may not mean it's true elderly use restriction. We're looking for a use restriction on the elderly that per the federal standard is 62 and over. So is there a use restriction on the project that has an elderly designation? That's the key part. Number 4, remember long-lived building systems or components. And I put in here Mortgagee Letter 2012-25. And that Mortgagee Letter is actually a HUD Office of Multifamily Housing Mortgagee Letter that talks about long-lived building systems. These are typically your building components that have estimated useful life exceeding 40 or 50 years. And I say that because think about the study we're doing. The RPCA looks at a 20-year snapshot. What repairs are needed now, and what future repairs may be needed in the next 20 years. And so that includes things like refrigerators and cabinets, flooring and windows and roofing and all those good things. But we need to look at the long-lived building systems, and that would be things like buried sewer lines, which have an estimated useful life of 50 years. The actual potable water lines, the copper lines, 50-year EUL, are those being accounted for? The foundation structure. So long-lived building systems need to be looked at. Do not be surprised if your needs assessor requests that the sewer lines be scoped for inherent, for their condition. The RAD scope of work for property needs assessment does include language called intrusive and forensic investigations. And what that means is that any system that can't be evaluated during a capital needs assessment because it's hidden, it's behind walls or underground, and it has the potential to expire in that 20-year term, looking forward, should be assessed. So if I have a property that's 40 years old, and I look at a 20-year term, that's 60 years total, sewer lines have a 50-year EUL, so either I assume the sewer lines will need to be replaced in year 10 of the R4R, which could be a very sizable hit to your deposits, or alternatively, the housing authority could show some scoping. Have your sewer lines been scoped? Have they been jetted? Have they been worked on? That data, if you give it to us, or if you decide to go do it yourself, could mitigate a lot of future repairs that we may have to forecast and fund up front. We have a question. We're unsure which financing scheme we are doing after the RAD conversion. What level of environmental due diligence should we do? It's a great question someone asked. That they're unsure of what financing scheme they may use. So how much environmental do you do? We have this question come up a lot with our clients, and we'll actually be like, our needs assessors are dual trained in environmental. So what we'll do is, okay, let's just put a small fee on there to collect the environmental due diligence, what we call barriers to mortgage insurance or red flags, and we'll do that assessment. We'll do it at the same time, but we won't do the reporting. It'll be just a quick little email to you guys. We'll hold all the data. We'll do what we need to do, to feel comfortable that we got all the stuff in the financing plan, and then hopefully between milestone 90 and 180, You've firmed it up, and you know which way you go, and now we backfill with the reporting. So we don't reduplicate efforts, but you still have the data you need up front. But those are the relationships you need to have with your needs assessor, because it's almost an architectural-like relationship. It's not just go do a study for me and give me a report. There's much more involvement in that to understand your project. Hopefully that answered the question. Common issues. I talked about this. Davis-Bacon wage rates cannot be avoided. I put in parentheses even in a LIHTC pilot. And I put this because there's a lot of FHA map lenders out there that are pushing what we call the LIHTC pilot program to RAD transactions. And what this means is that if you're using a 4% bond, a LIHTC transaction, you can still get under the 223F commitment for faster processing, and you can do up to $40,000 per unit in repairs. And in the world of conventional housing and affordable housing finance, it's a great program because it avoids Davis-Bacon wage rates. However, because of the way the RAD notice was written, the original housing notice, we cannot avoid Davis-Bacon ever. So that's misinformation. If anybody tells you can avoid Davis-Bacon in your RAD transaction, it can't be done on immediate repairs. It can't now. The reserve for replacements, all those repairs year 1 through 20, Davis-Bacon does not apply to those. It only applies to your rehab repairs that you're doing in the first 12 months of the project. Common issues. Lack of property details. That sheet I provide you is our way to try to get more details, because often we can't get that information. And in the conventional world, we pull tax records, real estate tax records to get property information. But as many of you know, you don't have real estate taxes, so there's very little at the municipality level. So to get the number of buildings, we're looking at aerial photographs. To get the date, we're looking for a date in service and HUD records. So various ways. In utility structure, we often can never get, so that's what we're looking at you. That information, that's one of the best. If you're master metered, yell it, make sure your needs assessor knows it, put it in your RFQ or RFP, because that will mitigate a sizable amount of cost, because it's an easier project if it's master metered for us for data entry. Number 7, functional obsolescence. This comes into play when we're doing especially HUD mortgage insurance programs. But I put in EUL, RUL, and REL. One thing about this, any HUD training or any HUD webinar, there's way too many acronyms. HUD just loves putting letters together, so I'll define these. EUL, estimated useful life. That's a term we use for components. So a refrigerator, for instance, has a 12-year estimated useful life. Carpet has a 7-year estimated useful life. Buried sewer lines have a 50-year estimated useful life. It's just an estimate. It's a mean average. But those EUL values need to be entered into the RAD Excel tool, because you take the date of service, the date of repair or replacement, in the EUL, and it calculates when does that component most likely need to be replaced. And that's what generates your needs. So EULs are very important to understand the basis of them. RUL is remaining useful life. Now that usually means either it's an inversion of EUL, so the age minus EUL is RUL. But okay, so that's how that one works. But then REL is more important. That's remaining economic life. And that's really an appraiser term. And so if you're using the 223F program or 222-4 or Fannie Freddie, remaining economic life comes into play, because in the HUD programs, your mortgage term is often a percentage of the projected remaining economic life. So the larger economic life you can get out of a project, the better loan terms you can get. Functional obsolescence has also played an issue with some of the marketing studies or appraisals in RAD. And I bring this up because we have seen, not a lot, but we've seen some housing authorities that have 5-bedroom, 1-bath units. 4-bedroom, 1-bath units. And while that may be appropriate in some of the public housing stock, when you enter the Section 8 platform, that's not typical. Usually I got 4 bedrooms, I'll have 2 bathrooms. 5 bedrooms, I'll have 2 bathrooms. So that will be a discussion with HUD. If we see 4 and 5 bedrooms with 1 bathroom, we'll bring it up as a potential issue, so you start having those discussions with your financing plan people to make sure they're still going to weight those units appropriately. It might be a good reason to enter bucket number 3 and put in another bath. You know, make it a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. You know, various ways we can do it. Common issues, misperceptions of RAD. I won't go into this too much, but if you look on the internet and type in RAD for news articles, you see a lot of misinformation. We see a lot of resident advocacy groups that are misinformed, thinking they're being kicked out of their units, when in fact it's just the opposite. They're protected. So misperceptions in RAD, it's a giant PR campaign for all you out there thinking about RAD. Obviously, you're going to have you already had some community meetings. You'll have some more going forward, but being upfront with them about the process is key. And that's where a good needs assessor can help you with that communication. Number 9, energy data, energy water conservation measure implementation, and utility allowances. These are common issues because we need that energy data, or we can't get your RAD RPCA approved. So back to the UCB, it has to be done, and we need that stuff. Again, if it's gut rehab, we don't have to do it. For all other conditions, we have to get that data. Energy water conservation measure implementation. This is interesting that the RAD Excel tool, it really defaults that the needs assessor needs to pick the green option. So I'll use HVAC as the best example. Well, let's just say you have a SEER 13 HVAC system. So obviously our traditional replacement would be replace like for like, which is a SEER 13 efficiency system. But we need to put a G1 and a G2, which is green option 1 and green option 2 in there. The workbook makes us do this. HUD will make us do this. So we put in green option 1 would be a SEER 14, and green option 2 would be a SEER 15. Obviously the cost of all those is variable, increasing as you increase the SEER, but also the energy use will decrease as you decrease the SEER rating. So the RAD Excel tool actually calculates payback based upon the differential in cost between a SEER 13 and SEER 15 divided by the energy savings, and it will identify with a big green box or a big red box if the green option makes economic sense. The interesting thing here is that you, as the waiting list participants, don't need to pick the green option. The needs assessor needs to default to it, but you could say, you know, we aren't going to pay for SEER 15, we're going SEER 13. We can fully make that option, but you aren't going to have any energy savings to underwrite either. This really is important in things like carpeting, painting, floor covering, ceiling tile, where many of the current RAD needs assessors believe they got to scope out the green option in those. I'm rather pragmatic, and I'm a true affordable housing preservationist, and I know that doing green carpet and green paint will add 20 to 30% of your construction costs and have really no economic benefit and not much benefit to the tenant either, so we typically turn those off for you. But that's the key thing, to know how the tool works, because if they go all green in their scenario, you could increase your cost by 20% quite easily. And if you're doing bucket number 1 self-financed, that's a disservice to you because it may not show you the proper path to get there. And the last one's a big one. Municipal involvement, pre- and post-conversion. This recently popped up on one of our projects. Envision a 20-acre property with multiple duplexes throughout, some through streets and some driveways everywhere. And currently, the municipality paves those streets. You know, the private streets, paves those streets throughout the project, owns the sidewalks that go around the streets, and also is responsible for all sewer and water lines. Guess what happened once they heard they were doing RAD? The municipality said, oh, not ours anymore, now it's private. So now we look at the lot lines, and now we have a whole lot of driveway and private through streets where now the capital expenditure of maintaining those is the burden of the housing authority and not the municipality anymore. Same with the water lines and sewer lines. So have those if you have one of these sites that has through streets and the municipality takes care of a lot of your stuff, understand that arrangement before you get too far along, because the needs assessor may not size that in the capital plan, and we find out later on, and in this case it was roughly almost $1 million of additional work that they had to come up with. That was a big surprise because all bets were off the table once the city said, nope, not our responsibility anymore. So work through municipal involvement for sure. And now I'm going to get to my last slide, and I do expect a whole bunch of questions I hope pop up. But and this is what I want to say about RAD. Creativity in RAD. It is a creative housing preservation program. We have a department that's really willing to work with all of you that understands the importance of transferring projects from a Section 9 to a Section 8 platform and allowing creativity to happen. Example being portfolio analysis to create synergies in rent bundling. I mentioned that one where we took 3 small housing projects managed by the same PHA and combined them into one AMP, more or less, one CHAP. Bundling, it worked. I have one right now in southeastern, very rural, where we have 2 housing authorities that are neighboring to each other. And individually, they each have 150 units, but together they'd have 300. They're actually discussing the idea of, do we dissolve the housing agencies and combine the projects to make this synergy happen? And that's a valid discussion, and that would be allowed. That's creativity in RAD. Use of Section 18 demo disposition in RAD is another very creative structure on many different fronts. We worked with San Francisco Housing, which I know you guys might be aware of, but really ended up in the end, 6 of their projects were able to go demo disposition, actually with disposition, to take those rents and move those rents elsewhere, and now do 9% applications of some towers that are in Chinatown and some very downtown locations. How exciting is that? Now, a couple things with demo disposition is that if you're demoing and rebuilding like for like in RAD, there's no need for SAC involvement. Special Application Center. That's not really Section 18 as long as you're rebuilding the same number of units. Couple things if you're under RAD doing a SAC transaction, because you're allowed to do sort of, if you've already started the process with SAC in Chicago and now you're doing RAD, they can transfer that over, but it's definitely, there's some difficulties there, but it's getting better. Nice thing is SAC did put Kathy Zibris, can't pronounce her last name, but she's sort of the SAC RAD liaison, and since they put her in place, it's been much easier for SAC to not create friction with RAD. And of course, Tamara Gray understands the mission of RAD very well. But if you do under RAD, you do demo disposition, do understand you don't get any tenant protection vouchers. There's no TPVs under RAD. There's only TPVs under Section 18. Also, demo disposition in RAD. If you do it within the RAD program, we need to figure out all those demo disposition requirements before the 180-day milestone, before the financing plan. So that's a pretty quick trigger to do this, because obviously in demo disposition, you prove it either through functional obsolescence by a cost factor. Don't quote me, but from memory, if you're a high-rise, it's 62.5% of the TDC, total development cost, and if you're non-high-rise, it's 57.5% of the TDC, total development cost. You got to show really high dollars of repairs needed. We're also getting demo disposition under RAD just by justifying functional obsolescence. Those 4-bedroom, 1-bath, 5-bedroom, 1-bath, units in a floodplain. We also have one right now we're working with SAC within RAD based upon the scattered site nature of the project. It's just not functional even to manage and maintain. It costs too much. We're trying that argument. But it's nice to know that a year and a half ago, SAC and RAD were like oil and water, and I'm happy to say today that they really are mixing together like a nice vinaigrette now. So it makes me happy that it's much more amenable, the relationships we have between SAC and RAD. But do look at the Section 18. It's a very creative way to use RAD. Rebranding of a PHA. This is one of my favorites. We've now had 3 PHAs do this. And this is where you're a public housing authority. I hate to say it, but sometimes there's a stigma attached with that term in your community. If you look at what like Boulder Housing Partnership did out in Colorado, it was years ago, it used to be Boulder Housing Authority. They rebranded themselves to be a true community development organization. That energized their employees, energized their residents. The mission's greater. And really, if we look at RAD, I look at RAD as a giant educational platform to show public housing agencies how to be nonprofit developers. The Section 8 platform is very solid, much more solid than the Section 9 platform. And then it will show you the light of how to do affordable housing preservation in your community. Back to that Section 9, Section 8 stuff, I just want to make one more point here. It's not my discussion, but under Section 9, your current capital fund grants, your ACC, you're decreasing, 1.5%, 2% per year in the numbers. Your funding is going down. When you enter the Section 8 platform and get PBRA or PBVA, you are annually subjected to OCAF. OCAF, Operating Cost Adjustment Factor. In the Section 8 platform, those rents increase on average 1.5% to 2% per year. It's the exact opposite of Section 9. So your rents that you model in Section 8 are going to increase with inflation. Where in Section 9, we know that they aren't making that increase at all. In fact, it's titrating off the other direction. So the preservation balance of IDRR and ADRR, this is a big one, and this is where, back to vetting your needs assessor, they need to understand some underwriting. They need to understand preservation, because how do we balance an initial deposit with an annual deposit in order to pay for repairs but also create cash flow? We know in a RAD transaction that if you have an annual deposit going forward or a per unit per annum of over $600, $700 per unit, there's no cash flow at the project. It doesn't work. Most of these preservation deals, we need to get the annual deposits down to $500 or less per unit in order to show you can pay the expense ratios of other fees. But in doing so, if you preset the ADRR, it backs into an IDRR. It's like a giant teeter-totter. There's only so much money to be had, and where do you put it in the transaction? On the front end, or do you put it continually through the 20 years? And that balance, that preservation balance, that's a high level of thought that your needs assessor needs to understand mixed financing. Number 5 is a great one. Reducing expenses through energy upgrades. I talked about how the RAD toolbook will actually show you the energy savings, calculates those out going forward. HUD's going to recognize approximately 50% of those in your pro forma. So if you currently have an expense of, let's just say you're averaging $800, let's say you have a pro forma and your expenses currently are $5,000 per unit. Of that $5,000 per unit per year, you know that 1,000 of that's utilities. If we can put new boilers in the tower, new chillers and stuff, part of the RAD transaction, and show that we're actually going to save, about $200 to $300 per unit per year in energy savings, on a prorated basis, HUD will recognize 50% of that. If you do the math, now all of a sudden your pro forma, your expense ratio went from $5,000 a unit down to $4,850. That's a sizable, that's a wonderful little deviation that can actually fund more dollars into your loan. So really looking at the energy expenses, and this is another reason why your needs assessor needs to understand this, because we often see housing authorities that say, I want my management offices to have new carpet, new paint, new ceiling tiles, all this good stuff, and I want to put laminate flooring down in the community room, and I want to do some institutional kitchen stuff, and so we have a $150,000 wish list item, which is no energy savings. And yet I see a boiler that needs to be replaced in year 5 of the R4R for $80,000. I know by replacing that boiler, I can show you almost that amount in savings per year. Payback on these boilers is 2.5 to 3 years for a modulating condensing boiler. I will have a tough discussion with you to say, hey, you know what? Can we think about doing the boiler now and maybe foregoing some of the finishes in your management offices? And the reason is because there's greater payback on that boiler, more economic sense in the transaction. So when you get these RAD toolbooks and the repairs, I think it's key to look at years 4 through 8, 4 through 10, what big repairs are in there, and should we be doing that now to capitalize upon energy savings, which HUD's going to underwrite part of it to provide more dollars for your loan. So number 6, making small PHAs work. Recap Advisors did a study back in 2010 as well, talking about the PHA stock, and they really identified, they didn't use the bucket term, but there were 3 different types of transactions. And one type, they said, deals that stand very well on their own. Second type of projects are the ones that will need some financial assistance to get there. And then 1/3 they called social assets, meaning that no one's going to lend on them. If you look further into that study, those social assets disproportionately were small PHAs. That concerned me as well as a lot of people in the industry, but I'm pleased to say to you guys that we've made small work through bundling these projects, through using preservation scenarios, being very creative. So the small PHAs should not shy away from RAD. And lastly, creativity is welcome. We have so many case examples. Every time we seem to get one of HUD's newsletters, they've been producing every month. Usually almost every one of the case studies in there we did work on. We have a very high rate of closings, RCCs. But it's neat to see some of the cool ones we've done. We did a RAD conversion recently where it converted out with a self-finance deal, turned around and sold the elderly property to a nonprofit developer with a 99-year land lease, and then they're taking the proceeds to build something new. So they exited HUD, put a Section 8 contract on it, sold the building to nonprofit local developers who's actually mission-based, and now they're building something new. So they actually get 2 for 1 on the program. They doubled their housing. Very exciting. That's possible. But B, I talked about that, 3 scattered sites in 1 application. That's that one I chatted about. That was really neat to make synergies. Most 9% and 4% applications, there's a transactional cost is rather high. So if we don't see 130 to 140 units in those packages, the transactional costs are so high. Is it worth it? Not everybody's going to say that and be honest, but really what it comes down to, I think 122 was the actual number somebody calculated from Boston Cap one time. But really, we need to have so many units in it to have transactional costs covered. So think about combining properties, but don't mix elderly and multifamily, please. We did one of 157 scatter site townhomes in an inner city location. One of the more challenging projects I've ever done. It's been showcased in Novogradic's tax credit manual as well as HUD's website called Broadway Townhomes. Very exciting project. One of the first to close, but we've proved that scattered site could work. And that actually worked with a 221D4 mortgage insurance, which was even more surprising. And the last one's one we're still working on. It's got the RCC that hasn't closed yet, some complications, but they're actually trying to do 15 projects in 1 bond deal. And that's the transactional cost. This reduces their transactional cost to minimal compared to the number of units they get. They're very exciting, kind of neat, so we're working on that. And along the bond deal idea, back to making small PHAs work, we know for a fact that there's 3 state finance housing authorities in the southeast that are seriously discussing doing a state bond fund for the small PHAs to give them a way to access capital of a small size. We hope to have more information about this in the spring, but it's very exciting if we can get a few states to do state bond programs. Now state agencies have a place to drink from the well without a huge transactional cost. So as RAD continues to evolve, we see more and more creativity, and I'd almost say nothing's off the table. We're willing to hear of every possibility out there. Every once in a while, a scenario comes past my desk where it's like, that can't do that, and here's why. But 9 times out of 10, I'm like, let's figure out a way to get this done. And again, I want to compliment Housing Urban Development because they have such a bright staff on RAD that's willing to listen and help that these crazy scenarios that you have here, they wouldn't have been possible if we couldn't have had discussions with them about pros and cons of going different ways. And they're really willing to work and to help you in your transactions. So with that, I really get to the questions, and if there's some now, that's great. If you want to send them to Joe or I privately, that's fine too. I make myself available all the time to answer questions on RAD. I've been living RAD for 3 years. It's my neurosis, I like to say. But here to help. I hope you enjoyed the webinar.